Hello, today I'm going to rank the Shirley Jackson novels. If you've never read Shirley Jackson before, firstly, what are you doing with your life? It's okay, it's never too late. Very quickly, Shirley Jackson is an American writer who published from the 1940s up until her passing in 1965. Her work is often characterized as psychological horror or dark fantasy, but actually she is so unique and influential, her style is almost a genre in its own right. She wrote hundreds of short stories, a children's book, two memoirs, and six novels. She had begun a seventh before her passing that was subsequently published in the collection Come Along With Me. But for the purposes of this ranking, I am only concerned with the six novels she finished and published in her living. And naturally, this ranking is based purely on my own opinion, my own tastes and experiences reading Shirley Jackson. Perhaps you agree or disagree. Leave your comments below. I'd be curious to hear your opinions on one of my favorite authors. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's jump in. My sixth favorite novel of Shirley Jackson is The Sundial. Published in 1958, it was her fourth novel, and if I'm being honest, it's the only novel of hers I didn't really like. In The Sundial, a wealthy family in France essentially sequester themselves in a house as one of the characters claims to have received a vision that the world is about to end. In much of Shirley Jackson's work, she weaves together darkness and mystery, magical thinking, and humor. However, in The Sundial, I feel she went more for the humor, and it just came across as overly silly to me. I appreciate her humor, but The Sundial didn't have the balance of humor and drama I usually get from her work. And it came across as a bit too cynical as well for my liking. My fifth favorite novel of Shirley Jackson is The Road Through the Wall. Published in 1948, The Road Through the Wall was her first novel. When I read it, I was already familiar with her work, and it was interesting to see her style and her voice in their formative stage, if you will. I could see in The Road Through the Wall similar themes she would go on to explore in more depth in subsequent works. And it was interesting to see that even Shirley Jackson wasn't always the great Shirley Jackson. She worked at her craft, kept writing, kept producing, and then became the iconic writer we know and remember today. It's a bit obvious, but as a writer myself, I always find it inspiring to read early works from a writer I admire. And I get the sense, I see where she's going, I see what she's trying to do, and to know that she or he would eventually get there, and to know that it came through persistence and hard work is inspiring. And The Road Through the Wall had that effect on me. Still an enjoyable book, but it's early Shirley Jackson, obviously. The story takes place in a middle-class suburb in California, where a portion of the suburb's surrounding wall is being torn down to make way for a road. And like much of her work that would follow, it examines close-knit communities, the hypocrisy, the backstabbing, the facade they put up. Definitely worth checking out for Shirley Jackson fans. My fourth favorite novel of Shirley Jackson is The Bird's Nest. Published in 1954, The Bird's Nest is Shirley Jackson's third novel and one of her most commercially successful works. The story centers around a 23-year-old girl named Elizabeth who suffers from a bit of an identity crisis, later diagnosed as a multiple personality disorder, what we call today dissociative personality disorder. It's one of the earliest books I could find that deals with this disorder, and coming 20 years before the mega hit Sybil, which brought the condition into the public consciousness. Like a lot of Shirley Jackson's work, The Bird's Nest examines identity, especially a woman's identity, and the social pressures that are put on women, forcing them to conform to a preconceived societal ideal. And The Bird's Nest does this in a rather overt way, as halfway through the book, the focus shifts off of Elizabeth and onto the doctor who's treating her. And he is able to identify several personalities within Elizabeth. However, there is one in particular that most closely resembles his conception of the ideal woman. So instead of working to make Elizabeth whole, he attempts to suppress the other personalities and bring out this personality that conforms more with what society expects of young women. The doctor has a partner in his efforts in Elizabeth's aunt, which is a recurring aspect of Shirley Jackson's work. She often explores identity and the societal expectations imposed on women, who they should in fact be. And while this construct is generally orchestrated in large part by men, Shirley Jackson often highlights some women's, generally women older than the protagonist, but some women's complicity in this effort to restrict and mold. These are common themes in Shirley Jackson's work, and The Bird's Nest is probably the least subtle iteration of these themes. The book she wrote before that, Hangman, deals with similar themes, but in a far less obvious way. So in case you missed it, she comes out with The Bird's Nest and hammers it home, right? And it's effective, I think, and fun and an interesting read. Now we get to the final three in my ranking. And to be honest, here's where it gets difficult, because I absolutely love these three books. They are different, one from the other, each quite spectacular in their own right. Nevertheless, it wouldn't be a ranking video if I didn't rank. So here goes. My third favorite novel of Shirley Jackson's is the aforementioned Hangman. Published in 1951, Hangman is Shirley Jackson's second novel. And it's strange for me to put it at number 3. Hangman is one of my favorite books of all time. But that just goes to show how much I like Shirley Jackson. Hangman is probably the most experimental of her works. There isn't a lot that happens in this book. The pacing is slow, but it has one of my favorite characters in literature of all time, the protagonist, Natalie. Natalie is 17 years old, but she feels like she's really only been conscious since she was 15. She doesn't know who she is, in classic Shirley Jackson fashion. And she carries out conversations with an imaginary private detective and strange conversations with her father, who is a professor of literature. And she has an odd fascination with trees. The story, if there is one, is about Natalie, who goes off to university, where she is meant to discover who she is. Now, while reading Hangman, as it's not plot-driven and it's quite strange, I was intrigued, but I wasn't blown away. But it is a book that has stayed in my mind, a book that planted a seed that has since been nourished by my experiences and observations, and has grown and continues to grow. It's one of those books that gets better the more I think about it, the more time I have to digest it. Now, I will tell you, Natalie is not mentally well. So this book is quite dark and troubling. You get the sense in the book that it's unlikely that Natalie is going to get the help she needs. It also has one of my favorite passages in all of literature. Towards the end of the book, and this is not a spoiler, Natalie gets on the bus with her friend Tony, who may or may not be a real person, and they look at the other passengers on the bus. Look at that one. He looks like he works at a bank. And look at that passenger there. She's probably going home to cook for her children, that kind of thing. She looks so tired. Imagine having children, right? That must be so tiring. And it goes on like this for a few lines. until Tony says something like, look at all these people doing their own thing. Imagine being people. It was my favorite line in literature. Imagine being people. And since reading Hangman, and never have I got on a bus and I didn't have a look at the other passengers and not said to myself, imagine being people. I don't know. I just love that passage, and especially that line. If you've never read Shirley Jackson before, I wouldn't exactly recommend you start with Hangman. It's a bit experimental and strange. But if you have read Shirley Jackson and you liked what you read, I would definitely recommend checking out Hangman. So now we've come to the final two novels in the ranking. My second favorite novel of Shirley Jackson's is The Haunting of Hill House. Published in 1959, The Haunting of Hill House is Shirley Jackson's fifth novel, and probably, along with the short story The Lottery, probably her most famous work, thanks in part to many cinematic and television adaptations. The Haunting of Hill House is a Gothic horror story. It's an American classic wherein a researcher in search of proof of the supernatural rents Hill House and invites 4 people to spend some time there. And that's as much of the plot that I'll give away. The Haunting of Hill House, I believe, was greatly inspired by another American classic, the short story written by Charlotte Perkins Gilman in 1892 called The Yellow Wallpaper. And The Haunting of Hill House would go on to inspire many writers and many works, notably Stephen King's first novel, Carrie, and to perhaps a greater extent, his second novel, Salem's Lot, and every haunted house story that would come after it. It's a classic, it's a must-read, and for a good reason. It's a fantastic book. So it's interesting to follow the line of inspiration, if you will, from The Yellow Wallpaper to The Haunting of Hill House to Carrie and Salem's Lot, etc. It's nice to see this idea evolve and how many different creative people have explored this idea. Which means that my favorite Shirley Jackson novel is the last novel she would finish. We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which already is one of the best titles of all time, I think. Published in 1962, We Have Always Lived in the Castle tells the story of Mary Catherine, or Maricat, an 18-year-old girl, though with the emotional and intellectual maturity of someone much younger, who lives with her older sister, Constance. They live in a house in a small town. And the people in this small town do not like Mary, and they do not like her sister or her family. I'm not going to say any more about the plot because I knew nothing about this book when I went into it, and I was very glad for that. It was such a pleasure to discover the story as it unfolded with essentially zero expectations or preconceived ideas. I will say that it does explore similar themes of Shirley Jackson's work, life in a small town, the judgmental gossip, the hypocrisy. However, while it is creepy and unsettling, as you'd expect from Shirley Jackson, the book also has a lot of heart. So taking a step back and looking at Shirley Jackson's work as a whole, from her first novel, The Road Through the Wall, about a small town and the backstabbing and the gossip, which has quite a mean-spirited tone to it, all the way to her final novel, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, about a small town and the backstabbing and the gossip, which is a significantly darker work, but given the heart and sympathy that it also expresses, I don't know, it seems that maybe Shirley Jackson, towards the end of her life, might have come to terms or reached an understanding with her enemies in a way. That's the impression I get reading her work in its entirety. And it makes me feel good to think it might have actually been like that, but I don't really know. In any event, I'd love to hear your opinion on Shirley Jackson's work. the effect it's had on you, what you think of my ranking and my analysis and interpretation of her work. So please leave your comments below. Click like, hit subscribe. And if you haven't already, definitely check out Shirley Jackson's novels. There are links in the description, and if you buy through those links, it helps me out a bit. So I appreciate it. I also have books you can check out if you want. You can find them on Amazon or wherever you buy books. You'll probably recognize the influence Shirley Jackson has had on my writing, I suspect. And thank you for watching the video. And before you go, how about a little zvezda? Yeah?
Zvezda!
Zvezda.